and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre Viskontas. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. As my longtime listeners undoubtedly know, my decision to study the brain was heavily influenced by the writings of the late Oliver Sacks, who had this uncanny ability to humanize patients with various brain disorders and differences so that you got a sense of just how mysterious and poetic our brains are. So after my PhD, when I decided to go to music school instead of going in the traditional career path, and pursue a master's in voice performance, I found the one person whose approach to neurology was infused with the same deep humanity, curiosity, and wonder. And I asked him to let me work for him part-time so that I could keep up my musical training. Bruce Miller is the A.W. and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professor of Neurology and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, where he founded both the Memory and Aging Center, which is the world's largest research group studying neurodegenerative diseases, and the Global Brain Health Institute, which now has trained more than 230 fellows from over 50 countries and is committed to promoting equity and prevention strategies and care models for people who are at risk of developing dementia. Bruce was probably the only person in the entire field of neuroscience who, at the time, not only tolerated my dual passions of neuroscience and creativity, but helped me find ways to integrate them into a viable career path. With that said, Bruce's approach to using case studies as a way of understanding the brain holistically builds on the foundation that Oliver popularized, and now I'm delighted to say that he has co-authored a book with affective neuroscientist Virginia Sturm called Mysteries of the Social Brain. And in it, they walk us through the brain networks underlying our social lives, illustrated by cases of patients whose neurodegenerative diseases have disrupted those networks, and show us how the results are not just often unpredictable, but truly paradoxical. Bruce Willer, I'm so happy to welcome you to Inquiring Minds.
Indre, it's such an honor, and I still miss your inquiring mind, who really elevated the research at the Memory and Aging Center in so many ways. So, and also I've had the pleasure of listening to you sing, and that is also quite special. So, what an honor! Thank you, thank you.
So kind of you to say. So let's start with a kind of current modern understanding, the way you outline in the first chapter of your book, of the anatomy of the social brain. What have you learned? What do we know? How does this anatomy play out?
I think human beings are very special compared to other animals, and in many ways, I think we all understand that we have language that is much more complex than most other species. We have tool use abilities, which has led to unbelievable engineering feats. And shortly after the appearance of Homo sapiens on the Earth, our species, really transformed the planet in good and bad ways. The part of the story I think that has been left out in neuroscience and left out, I think, in the lay public is this notion that one of the reasons that we evolved and thrived was because we had large networks that allowed us to understand other people, to get along with other people, to think about elevating other people, and the social networks that we have in the brain are so critical for the development of civilization. Without those networks, we would be at constant war.
You know, you start with one of these clinical case studies of a patient named, I think it was Jamie, and her partner, Kurt, and their relationship. And you describe this first neurological exam that you did with her and tell us what happened at the end of that exam that forced you to actually help her partner more than
Yes.
her.
Yes. And so for me, it's always a exploration of a couple or a family. And it's not usually just the patient. And so in the course of my interview of this unbelievable caregiver, military trained, the best of the best, as he talked about his loved one diminishing, um, she watched, she didn't speak. She had really no language at that point. Left side of her body was paralyzed. And I noticed that Kurt was a little cautious in moving around her. And suddenly, as he was talking, she grabbed Kurt by the throat and came very close to strangling him. It was one of the most shocking things that I ever saw. And preceding this had been a story of sociopathy, anger, cruelty, loss of empathy. And this suddenly made me start to think that there are parts of the brain that we really must explore.
And you talk about how, that it's this caregiver didn't seem to resent her for the way that she treated him. That's really interesting to me, that he recognized that this was something related to her biology, and instead it led
Yes,
him to kind of lean into the caregiving. That
yes,
seems very noble and rare. And it
yes.
made me wonder then, like, what are his brain networks like? And you talk a little bit about how even
Hmm.
the relationship, probably solidified his networks in a way that were almost completely antithetical to hers.
Yeah, I think he was exceptional, like Jamie, exceptional, and but in a very different way. Jamie's brain before she got ill was very technically sophisticated. She had an engineering style way of thinking. Um, Kurt led groups of people in the armed forces, and he cared very much about people, watched them, thought about them, thought about ways he could be helpful. So by the time I met him, he was already extraordinary in the circuits of social brain. But I also I think so many of us as we take on roles as caregivers, whether it's children, our parents, we develop this part of the brain. We become better. It's just like an Olympic athlete. As a athlete develops their motor systems, we can see palpably the changes in the body and the speed and the movement. But I see this in caregivers as well, and it's one of the most noble things that we can do. And I believe it's one of the reasons that we survived evolution, is that because in groups we were able to do that.
I was always so impressed how at the Memory and Aging Center, the caregivers were given a lot of consideration. It wasn't always
Mhm.
just as you mentioned about the patients, and I think that's to do with your deep understanding that these diseases don't happen, or we as people, as brains, we don't act in a vacuum. We act in relation
Mm.
to others.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, like how did you develop that, deep sense, and why is it so rare in so many ways in which we, when I think about medicine, so much of the in, kind of lens is, well, what did you do? What did you eat? Did you smoke?
Yes,
All it's
yes.
just about the person,
Uh,
and very
right.
rarely about their context.
That's a really great observation. And I never start an evaluation with the problem. I always think that if I'm going to do something helpful to the patient, to the caregiver, to the dyad, I have to know them. And I'm really curious. I mean, I think medicine is an extraordinary opportunity to meet people, understand who they are, what their stories were. And in the frontotemporal dementias, if I don't know who that person was before the illness took hold, I will often be very confused about what the illness is. So it's curiosity. I think it's empathy, but also it's science. I think knowing that person really well and knowing how they relate to their caregiver is part of my diagnosis.
Mhm. So we should probably tell people about the frontotemporal dementias and
Yes.
sort of, yeah, they might have heard about them from, some of the recent press about Bruce Willis, but tell us about, you as one of the defining pioneers
Mhm.
of these degenerative diseases. How do we distinguish them?
Well, I think one of the things that we've learned, first clinically, but now using sophisticated imaging circuitry analysis, the type that you, Indre, do so brilliantly, we've learned that um, Alzheimer's disease tends to hit back parts of the brain initially, and the frontotemporal dementias hit the front part. And as we've learned about the circuits in the front of the brain, we've learned that they're really critical for drive, for empathy, for altruism, for uh, rewards, being able to inhibit a desire to get a reward. So, what we often see in the frontotemporal dementias is social collapse. People who suddenly lose empathy for people and do cruel things. People who get in trouble because they're disinhibited. They can no longer prevent the impulse to drive through a red light, to steal something if they're hungry. So the presentation is not what people think of with degenerative diseases. And often these people wallow for years in HR systems, marriage counseling, um, systems that really don't understand that the symptoms that they have developed are due to degeneration in the front part of the brain, the social brain.
I'm also interested in their own insight. I mean, I think from my limited experience, people who develop Alzheimer's disease tend to notice that something is a little off.
Yes,
But
yes,
if it's your social brain and your sense of your identity is in relation to others, like, do they
yes.
do they have insight? Do they notice?
No, they don't. Lack of insight is almost invariable.
Hmm.
And the even more remarkable part about this, Andre, is that sometimes they will recognize that they have problems with memory, but
Hmm.
the whole interaction with other people, the breakdown, the anger that other people might feel at them for suddenly no longer caring, they're very, very blunted in their understanding of that. It's really remarkable, and sometimes they might say it in a rote way, but understanding it and being able to change, almost impossible. It would be like trying to teach someone with a dense stroke in the language area how to speak again. The circuits are just walloped.
And that must be mean that they come to the clinic with pretty late in the disease, right?
Yes,
If those initial symptoms are not registering to that with them.
they do, and this has changed in the last few years. We've There are a number of genes that can cause frontotemporal dementia, and now we have large genetic outreach and large
Mm,
populations of people who carry genes that will cause frontotemporal dementia. Many of them are recruited before they're actually sick because we know they have a family history. And
mm.
to me, this is one of the most remarkable studies that we can do about the brain is thinking about someone who is caring, socially normal, connected to other people, watching how that might change slowly when a gene begins to fail them.
And I'm assuming that we don't yet have preventative treatments.
So
What is it?
close,
Oh,
so
great.
close.
Oh, that's
Yes,
great.
yes. So the genetic forms will, I think, be the first diseases to be treated. There are about seven trials for one gene that the patient we talked about suffered from,
Mm.
and that's progranulin. And we've learned that if we could just boost progranulin in the brain, we could prevent the frontotemporal dementia in those families. So that
Hmm.
those studies are underway. At UCSF, we're working with Nobel laureate Jennifer Doudna with CRISPR and great neuroscientist Claire Clellan through the Weil Institute. And we have said that we will have CRISPR cures for the genetic forms of frontotemporal dementia in 4 years. So this will be, I think, a really exciting time.
And obviously, once the damage is done, that's much harder to reverse. Are there
Exactly.
are there ways that also? I mean, there's some really great work having been done on the impact of, say, exercise on diminishing some symptoms of
Yes.
Alzheimer's. Is that also true for these frontotemporal dementias?
Yes, psychologist Caitlin Casaletto has studied these large populations with genes, and she has shown that being active, socially connected, and exercising seems to stave off, even in someone with a genetic form, the
Wow.
disease. So there are things we do in our lifestyle are protective. Alzheimer's, the same is true. Even people with genetic forms, I think there are some things that we can do to prevent the disease from occurring or stave it off till later.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And when you and I were working together, one of the things that I found really fascinating was this subset of patients who, in the course of the disease, usually it was related to language loss or semantic dementia. This idea of that you're
Yes.
losing conceptual language. Sometimes they developed these passions for artistic expression.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
tell us about
Uh,
that. That area.
Well, you did, I think, one of the most important studies we've ever had in the frontotemporal dementias, Indre. So, but what Indre did was she looked at this group of patients who were losing function in the anterior temporal lobe on the left, and many of them were visually creative. And what you showed was that the way they searched the world was different than the rest of us. And they tended to focus on things that we didn't focus on. And I think it gave an insight that the brain wiring had changed the way that this group of patients looked at the world. And later, we studied this group of artists, some of whom you had studied, with this peculiar visual way of thinking at the world. And we discovered that all frontotemporal dementia patients upregulate the back of the brain. So, this visual posterior part of the brain, particularly in these temporal lobe variants, is very hot.
Hmm.
Imagine that all of a sudden, someone like me who may be very focused in language and science is suddenly the back of the brain is hot. Some people take advantage of that and do very creative visual things, create beautiful gardens, do different things with sculpture, painting. We found that close to 10% of the people in that temporal lobe group actually became an artist of some kind.
Hmm.
They don't all become artists. I probably wouldn't become an artist because I'm just not wired that way. But I think with a supportive environment, we've learned that this part of the brain is rewiring, even though they have a degenerative disease. I just found it extraordinary. And now we've been thinking about your original experiments, Indre, and I will be talking to you more about this, but I think we need to understand better how these people with frontotemporal dementia are thinking visually, what gives
Mhm.
them advantages, and also what might lead the 10% to become artists.
It's the creativity is obviously something that I'm really passionate about understanding the kind of neuroscience of, and so much of it involves so many different stages and layers, but the ability to essentially see the world in a way that no one else does is one of the key features
Mm,
of the creative
mm,
brain. Of course, there's lots of other things you need to do then afterwards, but that always struck me is that and now we sort of there's has emerged also this finding that our visual imagination is also on a spectrum. So there are some people who have aphantasia, which means they literally can't imagine anything with their mind's eye, and some people have
Mm,
hyperphantasia, where I remember hearing about this one animator who never had to watch a film twice because he could literally remember frame by frame
mm, mm.
everything visually.
Yes,
And so when I think about then, like, of course these networks are going to impact, that kind of interior imagining. It's so hard to
yes,
study. But you've
yes.
worked with so many of these patients, like listening to them, talk, listening to them describe their inner world. How do you think they think of, how does their inner world differ from, those of us that
Uh,
maybe are more typical?
yeah. But the often we see this kind of extraordinary talent in people with real deficits. So like the person you described, I work with a young autistic boy named Dane who
Mm.
lost language and was very socially impaired. But when he saw Jumanji, he was able to, on a etch a sketch pad, draw the whole movie. It was there in
Wow.
his mind, and so I think it really is helping us understand that we have some circuits that turn others off and turn
Mhm.
them down, and when they are diminished in their dominance of the brain, that you can see extraordinary activities in other areas. Alzheimer's disease is very different. The back of the brain turns off, so you don't see many Alzheimer artists. But what
Mhm.
you often do hear is my mother became much kinder when she developed Alzheimer's disease,
Mm.
more sensitive. And, Bill Seeley at our place has shown that the social circuits in the brain turn up early in Alzheimer's disease,
Mm.
make some of them more sensitive, some more neurotic, but some more anxious,
Mm.
but exquisitely aware of social situations. And I think visionaries like you want to think about how we can bring out the best in the most of us.
Mhm.
What can people accomplish with music? How much changes when we take children and teach them how to play violin or how to sing. And I think it's the frontotemporal dementia patients suggest that we can do a lot. We can
Mhm.
do a lot with healthy people.
I have this one pet theory that I would love to, get your opinion on, about how music can help people in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease in
Mm,
particular, where
yeah.
for a lot of them, even when they're at the stage where they're not really communicating using language
Mm,
anymore, they're not really present in the same way. They don't recognize their loved ones and so on.
mm,
And you put on their favorite song from when they were 21,
yeah.
and they come alive. And it's
Yes.
not even just that, oh, they remember the music and they can kind of, it's almost like the person is back. And
Mm,
I have this theory
mm,
that, in these diseases, as these brain networks become disconnected from one another, you've got these islands of activity that don't,
yeah.
they're not communicating. Is it possible that something like music, which can maybe entrain some of the synchronizing, neurons in the brain, like, do you think they could pull these networks back online
Uh,
for a few
I,
minutes?
I love the idea. I think one of the things it's a great idea. I'm just thinking about how beneficial it might be too. Um, I've seen a comment. I've seen lucid moments in people
Hmm.
with these diseases, sometimes before death,
Hmm.
where someone hasn't spoken for years, and all of a sudden, the family thinks that they're back and they recognize people and they talk to them. So,
Hmm.
I think what you're touching on is really exciting. It's the idea that there is lots of circuitry left that can
Mhm.
give a pleasure to a person and
Mhm.
can elevate them and their relationship with other people. And if we could figure out a way of tuning into that through music therapy, it might be really, really powerfully positive.
Hmm.
As you and I know, a lot of the research on this is just beginning, but we need to do so much more because music is one of the few things that we know for sure in the setting of dementia gives pleasure, calms, and may, as you touch on, do more than that even. Yeah.
I think sometimes when we talk about these brain wirings and these networks and these connections, it's so easy to think of them in almost like a mechanical way that it's like hardware that is
Yeah.
immutable. But yeah, I mean, I think there's so much more flexibility, and from your work with these patients who kind of develop these artistic passions and interests, and ultimately good artistry, like
Mm,
their art became better in the setting of
mm,
neurodegenerative degeneration. That sort of help people think about what's happening when we're improvising, and these putting together these findings that
mhm,
improvisers actually actively deactivate the front of the brain,
mm,
and
mm.
let the back of the brain speak, as it were, and
Y-
they learn to do that with training. I wonder how you think about sort of the ways in which we as healthy people might better able learn to tune into these different networks,
Yeah.
and how we should do that.
Well, I mean, I think I'm doing a lot with my grandchildren now with music and athletics, and I think
Mm,
the story is really clear in athletics that you do something repetitively long enough with the cortex consciously, and then eventually this becomes ingrained in the more basic motor systems in the brain and the basal ganglia. And I think people have written about the flow in music when someone
mhm,
is really in a very creative, highly improvisational space. And like you say, parts of the brain have to turn off to do
mhm,
that. They actually would interfere with
mhm,
great shooting like Steph Curry or, great opera singing like you do.
mhm,
If you are holding on to the cortical conscious aspect of that process. So yeah, becoming deeper in the circuits in the brain that are deeper, that are designed to do this really well, need to be released.
mhm. We're also facing a time when a lot of us are spending more time alone, less time with
Mm,
others. A lot of our young people, but even our middle aged and older people, are spending too much time on their phones and other electronic devices. How do you think we could take what you've learned about the social brain and help develop better habits, and mitigate
uh,
against, I think, the risk of loneliness and so on?
I I mean, I think one of the areas that it really comes back to, and we're not in a particularly empathetic time right now, but is realizing that, touching other people is the most important thing that we can do. And I think the more that we teach children about this, that giving, being kind, helping people who are less fortunate, who are vulnerable, is, the best of humanity. It's not just efficiency or engineering or IT. It is really the human part that allows us to uh, make other people's lives meaningful. That makes our own lives meaningful as well. So
Mhm.
I think all parents. I know you're a parent. You must have children that want to spend time on their phones, and my grandchildren certainly want to spend time on their phones. And I think we have to emphasize the other things with touch with other people. With a great thing happened with my children, grandchildren, as they went down to the uh, Grace Church and spent time helping people with the soup
Mhm.
kitchen. So, I think this was the country I brought up in. John Kennedy said, "Ask not what you can." what I can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think we have to get back to that kind of thinking,
Yeah.
or we will continue to suffer.
One of the other really poignant, I mean, they're all poignant chapters in your book that I think is really worth leaning into a little bit is the chapter on openness. Because I
Yes.
think, right now we live in a world where a lot of big tech companies are actually motivated to keep us closed and to close us down
Mm.
and put us into filter bubbles. So tell us about what you've learned about openness
Yeah.
from your patients.
What I think, you know, we do not want to become rigid. It's one of the saddest, I think, human states. Sometimes, as people get older, they become more and more rigid. I think younger people are open to many different possibilities, um, and I think rigidity. What it really means is information. New information is no longer entering into the brain, that we are satisfying a single point of view, releasing dopamine every time that, single simple point of view that we hold is reinforced and reinforced again. And so what we've learned is that when people develop really fixed delusional beliefs, that there's very specific loss of function in circuits that allow us to be open in the prefrontal cortex. Um, and this is a tragedy. We would never have evolved. The frontal lobes are there to help us to adapt to the environment, to adapt to new environments. And if we are fixed on a single idea and never update that information, we as an individual, as a society, are going to make terrible, terrible errors. If we get fixed on the idea that all vaccines are bad for the brain, and a new virus comes along that kills 50 million people, the rigidity of thought is not good. And so I think, this is another thing that's so critical for children, is reinforcing critical thinking, open thinking, debate. One idea is not right. And I think developing those circuits in the prefrontal lobe makes us as an individual, us as a group, much more likely to cope with very threatening things in the future.
So much of what you describe in the book and sort of the consequences of neurodegeneration also seems to mirror the choices that a lot of us have made in terms of how we spend our time. I mentioned that we spend a lot more time online, and when you can't see somebody's eyes, it's really
Mm.
easy to hurt them and be cruel.
Uh,
But if you're looking into someone's eyes, the
yes,
only visible part of the brain, really, to
yes,
us,
yes,
it's harder to be mean. Um, and I wonder if
yes.
you also have a chapter on respect, and so, from these patients as they lose that, it seems like that there's probably, I don't know, tell us about sort of what we've lost, by not having these interpersonal, relationships that are in
Oh,
person.
yeah, I love what you said about the eyes. It's we have these very complicated, sophisticated systems that are designed to help us protect other people. We're not designed to hurt each other. And
Mm,
when people become very abstract, when you don't see the personal loss, or for various reasons don't care about the personal loss, uh, this is not a normal, healthy brain. When we lose empathy for other people, we know that there are very specific parts of the right side of the brain that are functioning poorly.
mm,
When someone has a stroke and can't speak, we understand there's a deficit there. But when someone is unempathic to large groups of people, uh, this is a deficit in the human brain, and it's
mm.
not something that is good for a society.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm being a
Um,
little abstract, but I think this is a time when One of the leaders, the Trump administration said that one of the worst things about Western civilization is empathy. And
Yeah,
yeah,
that's tragic. And yes, I totally agree. That I think that the loss of that has profound consequences that I think it's easy for us not to sort of see them as even potentially biological consequences, but if
yes,
in the way that you couch the social brain as a sort of adaptive tool that, natural selection is used to ensure that we can survive,
mm,
it starts to become a biological imperative to maintain empathy.
yes, absolutely. And as we face a future where many of our jobs will become irrelevant because robots can do them better.
Hmm.
Um, I think looking for meaning is a responsibility for all of us, but also of our government. How do we find meaning in people's lives?
So I want to remind our listeners that Mysteries of the Social Brain by Bruce Miller and co-authored by Virginia Sturm is now available at booksellers everywhere. So a lot of people, Bruce, have talked about this aging population. We're about to enter an era where in many countries there will be more older people than there will be younger people, which means that caregiving is going to be very challenging. What makes you optimistic about the science of our understanding in the treatment and potential prevention of dementia, but also in terms of, how we look to this future? Can you leave us
Mm.
on an optimistic note
Uh, I,
about, what's going to
I
happen?
am.
Great.
I am optimistic. I think elders have played a very important and good role in societies, and I think some of the social brain circuits actually show no effects of aging. They actually seem to be relatively spared. So this is, something that this part of the population naturally can give back to a society. I think
Mm,
the more that wise elders are around to remind people about kindness, about the society, the group, not just the advancements in technology. I think the healthier we'll be, and we are one of the only species with grandmother genes, with genes that actually evolved to protect us from dementia and aging.
mm.
And this differentiates us from chimpanzees and other primates with similar brains. So I think there's a reason for elders. And I think if we can protect them from functional decline, I think the great author Doris Lessing in Shikasta wrote about a society with people who lived to 150 years, and it was a really good thing. The wisdom that accumulated in those extra years was important. That's my optimistic view of this.
I love that. I love that. Well, Bruce Miller, thank you so much for being on
Thank
Inquiring
you.
Minds.
What an honor, Indre. Fantastic. Thank you.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I especially want to thank David Noel, Herring Cheng, Yushi Lin, Joe Henry, Joel, Charles Blyle, Dale Master, and Matthew Rowland. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viskontas. See you next time.